I also want to take a second to offer a semi-official welcome to our other guests, Professors Huebner and Kazin from the Ohio State History Department. We're really impressed that the Marion campus has drawn you here. It would have been quite a coup to snag either one of you, but both at once is really something. So welcome from the department. I want to also commend the board of the Harding Symposium for using the centennial of World War I to organize the symposium this year. It might seem like an obvious thing, but frankly, I've been really disappointed in the treatment that the centennial has gotten in the United States. There just hasn't been that much. And I got to be honest, even myself, in the midst of trying to finish out a hectic semester last April, I forgot that April 2nd was the date in which Wilson actually asked for a declaration of war. It just went right by me. But I don't remember seeing anything in the newspaper, very little on TV. There just wasn't much. And I know my thinking here is colored by recent experiences. I've had the chance to travel quite widely in Europe in the last few years, and I've spent a lot of time in European museums. Usually the main historical museums in the belligerent countries, the Imperial War Museum in London, the Museum of the Army in Paris, Les Invalides, and the German Historical Museum in Berlin. And it's striking to me how differently the war is treated in those institutions than even in our own Smithsonian, where World War I gets a kind of slight treatment on the second floor of the American National History Museum. It's really pretty paltry. And I get it. The war clearly was more catastrophic and calamitous in Europe than it was here. For Americans, it was a kind of brief event. Still, it was really a benchmark moment in the modern history of the United States, or at least that's what I'm going to try to convince you of today. So let me go on and start exactly this way. It seems to me that the best understandings of the war generally are those that tie it to the broad historical developments that we kind of lump together in what we call modernity. My favorite books, anyway, are the ones that make this connection quite explicitly. I think of Modris Eckstein's incomparable cultural history of the war, in which he does this very thing, or even back to the original cultural history of the war, Paul Fussell's Great War in Modern Memory. He does much the same thing. And I do think it's the best way to understand the broad streams of dynamic social and economic change that convulsed the Western world anyway. But even more than that, let me explain the pictures, or just kind of point up to them as a way of getting into the topic. So up on the left, I'll recommend as a good example of how American industry and mass production was marshaled for military production during the war. It's a picture of gun barrels being forged at Bethlehem Steel in Pennsylvania. On the right, I'll offer that as a glimmer of the world of urbanization, the second important part of modernity, or the second broad dynamic of modernity that I think we should consider. It's a picture, actually, of the February bread riots in New York City, where the working class immigrant neighborhoods turned out to protest the high price of bread. The prices were grossly inflated because much of the American foodstuff was being put on the market and being sent to the English and the French in particular, which was accelerating prices here at home. And then finally is the picture of Secretary of War Newton Baker choosing the first number in the draft in July of 1917. And I'll offer that as a symbol of the third important dynamic force in modernity, the rise of the nation state. What more powerful symbol is there, the might and dominance of the state over individual lives, than its capacity to conscript someone and take them to war, whether they wanted to go or not. In my view, anyway, Baker's action here is really a kind of important symbol in the importance of in the growth of the nation and the power of government in the United States. Now the thing is, I want to make a couple of points. These forces, industrialization, urbanization, and along with it migration, because you should understand that late 19th, early 20th century urbanization was a transnational dynamic that pulled people from the countryside, whether you're talking about Vienna or Paris or Tokyo or Buenos Aires or New York City in the United States. So urbanization and immigration, migrations of people from the countryside to the city are tied together, and I kind of think of them as the same thing. But all of these forces were international and common to all of the states, all of the societies that were becoming modern in the late 19th century and moving into the war. That's the first thing. The second thing is to notice that all of them had a centripetal power to them. That is, they concentrated and centralized human activity. They centralized economic activity. They concentrated wealth and power. They concentrated and centralized daily life, even in the case of the United States, American culture, which in the form of, well, sheet music or Hollywood, we began to see a kind of homogenization of American culture. Now, these are the forces that, as I say, really underlay the convulsions of the terrain of the Western world that resulted in the war. But what I kind of want to do today really is to suggest that the war also was a prism through which the way Americans in particular understood, tried to manipulate, or tried to resist and recoil against these forces. And so let's talk about the United States in particular. Even though these elements of modernity were common across the board, we're interested, of course, in how they worked themselves through during the war in the United States. It's well known, of course, that the decade or so, who knows how you would date these things, before 1917 was an age of reform, the so-called and very famous Progressive era, during which reformers tackled a host of problems, from municipal political corruption to quack medicine and rancid food, workplace safety and union rights, educational systems and juvenile justice, women's suffrage and child labor, and the list is much longer than that. Now, whether they were active locally or on the state or federal level, or like Jane Addams and many of the women with which she was involved, all three levels at once, progressive reformers saw themselves as bringing order to chaos. Now, that chaos, they understood, grew from the very forces that seemed to bring progress, those three elements of modernity. Powerful corporations brought industrial growth and things that people liked: electric lights, flush toilets, automobiles, among other things. But they also gave rise to widespread labor-capital conflict and an apparent chasm between the struggling working classes and the arrogant titans of industry, to borrow a phrase from Franklin Roosevelt. Urbanization promised many of the marvels of modern science and consumer culture, but cities teemed with impoverished immigrants crammed into slums conducive to the spread of communicable disease, drug and alcohol use, prostitution, what the progressives called white slavery, among other ills. And the centralization of the state after the Civil War in the United States, before it lent itself to any sort of regulatory mastery, seemed to offer just opportunities for more graft and corruption on a larger stage. Now, progressives developed a vocabulary to make sense of all this. The root cause of social disorder, they argued, was the laissez-faire, individualistic approach to pretty much everything that Americans characteristically took. Now, when they made this claim, of course, they had economic behavior in mind, and there was a common charge that the heedlessly selfish titan of industry was responsible for much of that chaos. But they meant a lot more when they spoke about individualism and laissez-faire. The heart of the problem was the doctrine, really, of American individualism, with which they argued discouraged collective solutions to problems, prevented foresight and planning, and worse still, the old American dogma celebrated folk wisdom over modern science and dilettantism, amateurism over expertise. In an age of centralizing forces, they argued, in which, like it or not, organization and coordination were becoming the rule in private endeavors, not the least of which one could find in American corporations. The old individualism scattered energies about and invited the self-interested to take advantage of vacuums of power to enrich themselves. To the progressives, in the same way that factory owners were discovering the virtues of efficiency of production, so the general public needed to recognize the social inefficiencies, as they often said, of contemporary ills, the waste of human capital, the squandering of energies, and unnecessary struggles to stay alive. Progressives insisted that the antidote to chaos was the application of knowledge through careful study of those ills that could reveal solutions and lay the basis for proper planning to avoid them, to correct them and avoid them. Now, it's really easy to lump progressives and reformers into just one uniform mass, and it's probably a real liability of a great deal of the history of the period that we still have a tendency to do so. I do think that there was this shared vocabulary among them, but there were many differences over particular issues, not the least of which was the war, and even more broad sensibilities distinguish them. What reformers and even more broadly the general public never really worked out during this period was whether modern democracy, I underscore that, modern democracy, called for a decentralized face-to-face society or a centralized polity managed by disinterested experts who knew what the common good was and what was good for everybody. Now, this tension came to a head in an obvious place in the election of 1912, which offered a great deal more choice than American elections usually do. It was a four-way race, many of you will remember, with William Howard Taft, representing the conservative business elements in the Republican Party, and on the other side, Eugene V. Debs representing the socialists. In between, Teddy Roosevelt announced himself committed to the new nationalism, while Woodrow Wilson touted the new freedom. In a way, Roosevelt and Wilson exemplified the tensions among progressives between centralization and decentralization, small is good liberalism versus regulatory liberalism that Roosevelt preferred. Now, the tension seemed to have come to a head there, but the election really didn't resolve anything, in part because Wilson only won because the Republicans were split. And so there was no mandate really for him one way or the other. The other thing about Wilson was, and we see this in his war policies, or pre-war policies for that matter, is that he was never really decisive on these things. And once he got into office, he seemed to prefer regulatory means and commission government just as much as Teddy Roosevelt did. It may have happened that this tension among liberals would have resolved itself in a kind of organic way had it not been for the war. But the war came into America at that moment when the unresolved debate would then get funneled through it. Wilson, I'm going to suggest to you, had really no choice if he was indeed going to be a war leader, but to accept the centralization of the economy and most certainly of governmental power, as much as he might not have wanted to in other circumstances. But what I'm going to suggest to you now is that the war provided the opportunity for Teddy Roosevelt's sort of progressivism, for the centralizers, they often called themselves the New Nationalists, to take advantage of the opportunity that the war gave them to push their kinds of progressivism that accepted the centralization of power on behalf of, well, a whole run of progressive ideals. They saw the centralization of the state and of the economy as a way of promoting social efficiency, another strange word when you put those two things together, but it was very much progressive. It allowed them, they believed, to exert expertise in public matters. And they also saw the war as an opportunity to focus national attention on a cause and promote an identity that was wrapped up in the nation state itself. It was a recipe for centralization of identity as well as political power. And they had to argue, and Teddy Roosevelt argued this really when he was president himself, that the national government, the national state, this thing, the American government, could be the expression of the democratic will of the people. It could be the expression of democracy, even as it became a centralized force in American life. All of these things lent themselves, I think, to the promotion, if not of war, but we'll get there, to preparedness even before the war. I'll show you some of the people around Roosevelt who made the argument. You notice Teddy, of course, and he was the best known of American progressives. He was the one who first really touted this thing called the New Nationalism, although he got the word and the ideas from this fellow here, Herbert Croly, whose younger colleague, Walter Lippmann, in the 1912 book Drift and Mastery, made the case for planning, for consolidated power, for shedding the old dogmas of American life, especially American individualism. The moment, he argued in Drift and Mastery, presented itself as an unusual window of freedom in which people who wanted to act concertedly, who wanted to impose a will on society, had an opportunity to do so. Now, the timing is what I'm trying to get at here, or I want to get at. It was in the midst of the consolidation of this sensibility, this progressive sensibility, that the war broke out in Europe. And at least this wing of American public life was poised to interpret the war in certain ways and to react to it, given what they had already decided about American society and the movement of modernity. Right? So they had primed themselves to react to the war in a particular way. Indeed, even before the war, they began to argue that the American military needed to modernize. And what happened here is really that military modernizers, Leonard Wood was the greatest advocate of it, began to apply progressive ideas to his own little orbit. He was the Army Chief of Staff in 1912 when he began to argue that the American military was so archaic that it couldn't stand a chance in any engagement with any of the other world powers. There were about 100,000 more or less in the standing military, such as it was. Another 100,000 more or less in the National Guard. But like the progressives around him, and I want to kind of sort Wood out here because he was by no means a progressive, except that he borrowed the language and the ideas. When he looked at his solitary orbit, that is, his unique orbit, and applied the progressive ideas to the American military, he began to argue, began to believe that the National Guard would never provide a reliable military force. They were, as he argued, amateurs. And they were poorly trained. National Guard leaders were no more than local elites, mayors here, lawyers there, who never really had any military training of their own. This whole thing was kind of a sham, Wood argued. And indeed, to make matters worse, the National Guard was really under the thumb of governors, not of the nation state itself. And the governors could direct or not direct the Guard as they wanted to do, and according to their own political interest or their own political oppositions. Wood found this an intolerable situation, but he also knew that he couldn't go to Congress in 1912 or 1913 and ask for increased appropriations in order to build a modern military that, say, just in case, might rival the French or the Germans. You never know. One of the things that began to spur Wood along was the instability on the southern border. The Mexican Revolution of 1911 had yielded into a prolonged civil war, and as a consequence created a good deal of turmoil along the border, including Pancho Villa's raids across New Mexico, and in the larger sense created a security concern along a very long expanse of borderland that the U.S. military simply was really not capable of protecting. This allowed Wood to begin lobbying some sympathetic congressmen, perhaps to begin thinking about modernizing the military. And again, I want to emphasize what I mean by that word, modernizing. It meant getting rid of the amateurism. It meant letting experts in military organization and military training take control. And it meant building a military in which people were specifically trained for specific tasks, just like the efficient workers of a mass production industry. Same kind of thing. The Mexican issue did allow him to begin cajoling some congressmen and beginning to build a certain base of sympathy for greater preparedness. So much so that in 1913, Wood, in conversations with a few other people, began to appeal to college presidents, perhaps to let their college boys use their summers taking in military training. What Wood had in mind was building a reserve Army officer corps. And of course, he had no interest in working class officers. He had no interest certainly in African Americans. It was the college boys, the best products of the American elite, whom he really wanted to cultivate for a reserve Army Corps. And indeed, in 1913, in Gettysburg and on the Monterey Peninsula, Wood put together a couple of college camps that were, at least by his light, wonderfully successful. And it allowed him to begin courting college presidents, including even David Starr Jordan, who was by no means sympathetic to the larger issues of preparedness. Once the war broke out, this preparedness movement began to take an organized form to push for serious modernization of the Army. Once the war began, Wood and Teddy Roosevelt began to argue that the only way to protect the United States was through the reorganization and the expansion of the military, to make this military modern. In 1915, just after the sinking of the Lusitania, a group of wealthy, in a lot of cases Wall Street bankers or lawyers, decided that they were going to push matters along by organizing the Plattsburgh movement. It was a kind of civilian training ground where they repaired for about 6 weeks to engage in classes on military strategy, get themselves into physical shape, because you know that sitting at a desk all day made you flabby and got you out of shape, and if you're listening to Teddy Roosevelt, turned you effeminate. And so the Plattsburgh movement was one of those interesting examples of the American elite cohering around the idea that preparedness was the best way to protect the United States from the new dangers that were afoot given the war. At the same time, really, as the preparedness movement began to push these efforts more widely, Roosevelt and Wood and many others began to call for UMT, or Universal Military Training. Now, you can look at this and you can say, well, it makes sense, okay? You've got an extensive war going on in Europe. Yeah, public opinion as of 1915 was not warlike, and certainly was not clamoring for intervention. But just to be safe, shouldn't we do this? Just to protect ourselves, shouldn't we modernize our military? You could make that argument, but the thing is, that's not really the argument they made. It was a secondary argument, actually. The main arguments for UMT was that it would bring progressive change and discipline and order to American life. It would solve those problems that so beset an industrial and urbanized America. It would push the classes together. As Teddy Roosevelt said, there's nothing like sleeping in a tent together to get the son of the banker and the son of the worker to see eye to eye. A strange illusion, I think. It would provide a possibility for the creation of a distinctly American identity and trump all of those other parochial and provincial and ethnic identities that seem to be dividing America. Indeed, this is exactly the argument that Leonard Wood made in a 1915 piece that he called Heat Up the Melting Pot. And I'm going to read some of it to you, and I want to emphasize again how Wood was borrowing from that language of the progressives to make the case for universal military training. America, he wrote, must be a real melting pot if we are to have people animated by a strong national spirit. A melting pot in which the various ingredients fuse into one homogeneous mass, a mass which in cooling will not harden in layers which separate under pressure, but rather a uniform mass. Great masses of new peoples are coming to our land. We are doing far too little in the way of making them real Americans. Naturally, they come in racial groups. Just so you understand this, the word race and racial connoted in these years pretty much what we would use the word ethnic for. So just off the top of my head, the Irish were a separate race, the Italians were a separate race, the Eastern European Jews were a separate race. That's the way the language was. In fact, the word ethnicity really didn't come into common usage until after World War II. In any event, let me go on. Naturally, they come in racial groups. Under the conditions which surround their early years in this country, they go largely to race schools and only too often remain in racial areas and are fed upon a dialect press. They do not come into contact sufficiently with the older residents, with the Native Americans, and as a result, they do not have impressed on them the fact that through their reception and naturalization, they become an integral part of the American people. We do not do enough to impress this upon them, nor do we give them something which would impress upon them a sense of their new responsibilities, of their commitment to the common good. Many of these newcomers enter our country with the idea that they have no specific obligation toward the state, especially no military obligation. They feel that this is a land of liberty, confusing only too often liberty with license. They feel that they are under little restraint, and that they may serve the nation in time of trouble or not, just as they like. Many of them come here with a view of avoiding the military. They do not realize that under our Constitution and laws, all males who are physically and mentally fit are liable for military service. What is needed then is some kind of training, which will put all classes which go to make up the mass, which is bubbling in the American melting pot, shoulder to shoulder, living under the exact same conditions, wearing the same uniform and animated by a common purpose. This something will be found in the system of universal training, where all classes of men, Jew and Gentile, rich and poor, Protestant and Catholic, upper and lower social classes work shoulder to shoulder, animated by a common purpose, that purpose being to better prepare themselves to discharge their military duties in case of trouble. But the military training is not just the only advantage. Another is the result in the way of increased national efficiency, which will come from a greater degree of national solidarity. Men will learn to think more in terms of the nation and less in those of the individual or the small community. It will also be an insurance for peace, because in the end, we shall be the strong man armed. I think it's clear enough, I hope anyway, that Wood here was marshaling the language of the progressives to make the argument for preparedness. That argument spread out, and as Professor Kazins mentioned to us, a whole series of organizations, the most important and largest of which was the National Security League, began to promote preparedness generally and universal military training specifically. The National Security League, located in New York City, engaged in a great deal of organizing. By 1916, they claimed 250 chapters nationwide and some 100,000 members, almost all of whom were members of local business and community elites. They had an annual congress each year that they called the Annual Congress of Constructive Patriotism. Notice the avoidance of any kind of aggressive, militaristic language, constructive patriotism. Here are the employees of the New York office doing calisthenics, so presumably preparing themselves in whatever way and getting rid of that flabbiness the office created. Through 1915 and 1916, the agitation for preparedness accelerated and spilled out into a whole host of books. Wood himself commissioned a historian to prepare the military unpreparedness of the United States, an 800-page tome of unrelenting criticism of the American military organization. Roosevelt published his own Fear God and Take Your Own Part, demanding American attention to preparedness. Owen Wister, whom some of you might remember as the author of the original Western, The Virginian, and a longtime friend of Teddy Roosevelt, published The Pentecost of Calamity in 1915. Another, John Walker, America Fallen. But not to be outdone, this fella here, Hudson Maxim, published his book, Defenseless America, in 1915, in which he warned that unless the United States modernized its military and prepared properly, that war then was inevitable. He told his readers that 100,000 Germans were poised to march across America, and that our wives and our daughters and our sweethearts would be commandeered to supply the women in song. It was such a striking book that one filmmaker, the president of an outfit called Vitagraph Films, read it and decided to make a movie out of it. The movie began to appear in 1916 under the title, the oxymoronic sounding title, The Battle Cry of Peace. The seeming confusion of the title, however, was no confusion to the preparedness people, because they were arguing precisely that unless the United States prepared properly, there would be war, and the United States would lose it. In this bizarre film, which oddly showed Maxim quite a lot. Here he is, by the way, shooting off the family machine gun. His brother owned the Maxim machine gun factory, and it wasn't lost on a lot of people who read the book and then watched the movie that this guy might well be agitating for the profits of the family business, which of course he vigorously insisted were almost libelous. As a matter of fact, I'll say a bit more about that. But the plot of the movie and the way the movie went spoke to the hyperbolic quality of a lot of the preparedness propaganda. So the whole plot begins with a episode of pacifists, tens of thousands of pacifists at a pacifist meeting in New York City, when the Germans all of a sudden show up. Actually, they're not Germans. It's an unidentified enemy, but they had pointy helmets. And so it was kind of obvious what he was implying there. The New York Times reviewer of the movie sarcastically wrote, "While the enemy is unnamed, they sure aren't Portuguese." And the Germans lay waste to the city. They bomb and they cause carnage. They burn down all the estates on Long Island. And of course, the point seems pretty obvious that that's what's going to happen to us if we don't prepare. Henry Ford watched this movie and was appalled by it. In fact, he made it clear that for his money, anyway, this was just a pack of lies. They got in a quarrel, Maxim and Ford, during the summer in the newspapers. Maxim published a very long letter to the editor in the Times defending himself. And by the end of the summer, Maxim and the Vitagraph filmmaker sued Ford for $1 million in a libel suit. Michael, maybe you can help me. Do you know what the resolution of that suit was? I haven't been able to find. They must have dropped it because it seemed pretty crazy. So that's my sense of it. So this crazy movie did have quite a showing. It was subscribed nationwide. It made its way all the way to the West Coast. I don't even know how to make sense of this advertisement for the movie, because certainly this isn't the German army. I mean, and there's all kinds of racial components to this, and I mean, well, there you go. One last odd bit about it. The enlightened people who ran the Massachusetts Penitentiary in Charlestown allowed it to be shown to the inmates, and the inmates included Jesse Pomeroy, the boy serial killer. Jesse was the youngest person ever sentenced to death in the United States. I think he was like 14 when he was found guilty of a string of really lurid crimes, murders of small children in his neighborhood. And his death penalty was commuted, so he got a life sentence instead. And this was the first movie he was ever allowed to see. The local papers covered it quite enthusiastically. And not only did he get to see it, but they let him go back into the projection room, and the guy showed him how this newfangled machine works. I mean, the guy had been in prison for about 20 years at that point. He was almost 30 years old when he saw his first film. They let him take out the film and look at the pictures that he had to marvel at. When asked his opinion of everything, besides saying, gee whiz, wow, he said, you know, I guess this means we'll all have to enlist. Which no doubt he was hoping he could do. It's a strange case. Well, that was the state of the other side of the debate over whether the United States should consider going to war. It raises a really interesting question, a question I think that is worth talking to students about. And that is, if you prepare, do you go? That was certainly part of the argument of the anti-war, the anti-militarist arguments that were being raised against preparedness. It was certainly an argument that William Jennings Bryan made against the demands for preparedness and conscription. For preparedness, he said, the day he needs to do it, the president could call for 1 million volunteers, and the next day he would have 1 million volunteers in arms. Wood responded by saying Bryan was a first-class ass. But the thing is, the anti-war argument was right. The advocates of preparedness moved very quickly and steadily to demanding American intervention. As those very important events of 1917 ran their course, their demands for American entry into the war reached a fevered pitch, and when it came to it, they were advocates of conscription. So let's turn to that as an important marker of things as well. What's interesting to me about conscription is that it too was defended with all of the progressive sensibilities and language. Those who argued for the draft insisted that it would be another way of avoiding the amateurism of the National Guard and the parochialism of the Guard. And by the way, in 1912, the Attorney General held that the National Guard could not be used internationally, could never be dispatched offshore. And so this kind of obliged the federal government to raise the Army. And it's interesting to me that the tension between the regular military and the National Guard remains, actually. I don't know if you know this, but they still kind of look down, the regulars still look down on the Guard. I happened to have dinner with a former Marine the other night, a student of mine, and I was talking about this discussion. And he said, oh yeah, we always used to make fun of the Guardsmen when they came in. And I won't say, it's Marine talk, so I'll avoid that. But it's still there. It was very much active in World War II as well. But in addition to creating a professional army, conscription would embody national service. It would be asking for a concrete commitment to the common good of Americans. But this only raises a question. Okay, we see that, but why not rely on volunteers? Why conscription? Why not volunteers? Like Brian had announced. Well, it's because the argument for conscription, the defenders of conscription insisted that volunteers were just the old-fashioned American individualism, an archaic way to raise an army. The volunteer system, the Louisville Courier editorialized on the eve of war in April 1917, like the stagecoach, served its purpose in primitive times, but like that stagecoach, it proved unequal to the expanding needs of modern times. The volunteer system has been a failure wherever tried. And seeking efficiency, nations prefer the selective draft system. Just as seeking speed, they would prefer a locomotive to an ox cart. The modernization business is still very much there. And what's, again, interesting to me, or fitting in this line of discussion I've launched, is the selective part. So they weren't just going to draft everybody. The whole point was to use American manpower in enlightened and planned and efficient ways. Those people who had scientific expertise would certainly not do in a trench in northern France and Flanders. They would be much better off working, say, for DuPont. And this is the way Wilson thought about it. In his book, Professor Kazin really wonders some about what made Wilson change his mind about the draft. And it's an interesting question. It's just one of many of these mysterious little bits of Wilson's thinking that we still aren't sure about. But at least as the way he explained it, it was in perfect progressive terms. That is, a selective draft would allow the efficient use of American manpower, and he was actually thinking about the use of industrial workers, skilled workers, and defense plants more than he was for manning the trenches, which of course is kind of the opposite of what the military thought they were going to get out of a selective draft. They wanted the best men, right? The way the draft was set up really demonstrated a couple of things. First of all, that progressive ideals put to practical purposes were often not exactly effective. Did the draft work? Well, yeah, I guess if you just look at numbers. Almost 4 million men were serving in the Federal Army by November of 1918, and 72% of them were draftees. It turned out, however, that the draftees were not exactly prime candidates as warriors. For one thing, the military discovered that the physical conditions of American men were really pretty lousy. Regular visits to doctors were not common. In fact, you didn't go to the doctor unless you really had to, and often enough, not even then. There were class differences in physical conditions, and in ways that you might be surprised about. Both upper class white men and working class and African American men, they all had physical problems, the military found, but different ones. It does seem that the college boys were getting soft through lack of exercise, something that Teddy Roosevelt, of course, always complained about. But for working class men, the debilitation of the body and that very, very hard industrial work that they so often did had the effect of, hurting backs and knees and legs and wearing the body down, even for young men. The Army very quickly had to lower its physical standards in order to fill its quotas, but even then, at the end of the day, an estimated 2 out of every 3 registrants who were examined failed the physical tests. And in perfect progressive fashion, they also did IQ tests to measure the emotional and the intellectual abilities of the American draftees. Again, it's a typical progressive approach to measuring manpower. The military was not sold on the IQ tests, by the way, on the grounds that dumb men might make good soldiers. Their language, not mine. But the IQ test showed rampant illiteracy. Over half of the African American registrants were illiterate, and some 22% of white registrants were. They also showed a regional gap between Northerners and urbanites, interestingly enough, and rural Southerners. The rural Southerners being far more likely to be illiterate. Now, what's interesting about this, as was noted at the time in some quarters, was that it gave the lie to the old American view of the countryside as the bucolic bosom of all American virtues. Not so much when you got a close look at the differences even between urban immigrants and native-born Anglos from the South. As Professor Kazin's already noted, moreover, the draft was riddled with opposition and invasion, which were widespread. As he noted, 2 to 3 million never even registered. According to Jeanette Keith, who has by far the best book on this subject, in my opinion anyway, notes that in some jurisdictions in the South, some 80% or more of the registrants asked for exemptions. Desertions were high in the South and the Intermountain states, Montana, Wyoming, Nevada, places where you would think a military gung-ho attitude might have prevailed. Quite the opposite. But avoidance was also common in the cities, particularly where immigrant men found slacking, as they called it, pretty easy. It was easy to escape. And here's the point I actually want to end with this, in this line of analysis. Resistance and avoidance was easy because the United States was hardly beyond its provincial and rustic past. As much as the progressives wanted to think differently, modernity hadn't really captured all of America. Birth certificates, mail, these things did not necessarily go everywhere. To register for the draft, you had to get your draft notice. Well, what if you didn't get your draft notice? What if you just ignored it? What if you didn't go down to the mailbox and pick it up, or to the post office? Who's going to bring it to you? In a lot of places in the country, nobody. This is one reason I think Keith makes clear draft avoidance and opposition was very widespread, especially in Appalachia. There's no sheriff in Kentucky who's going to go up that holler to pull John Smith out of his family's home when he's got to go by about 40 cousins, all armed. He's just not going to do it. By the time the next war rolled around, things had gotten somewhat different in this regard, but it's important to remember in World War I, this rusticity still held in a lot of ways. Well, let me go very quickly over the way the war proceeded once it got underway. Wilson himself, this is another one of those areas where he just really was of two minds. Given his druthers, he would have preferred a small as good liberalism, but you can't fight a modern war that way. And so he knew that he had to centralize the economy, he had to centralize the effort, and that's essentially how he proceeded to do it. But he did it in a way that tried to avoid the image of tyrannical centralized power. Instead of putting all of the war effort under one umbrella bureaucracy, They basically organized most of the effort in different, what they called, administrations. The first issue was how to pay for it. Notice that they relied on war bonds rather than on taxes. And indeed, they got the majority of the money for the war from war bonds, which was in essence a way of not taxing the well-to-do, many of whom had been pushing for war since 1914 in order to pay for the war. Instead, they saw it as another way of bringing Americans into the service of the country by selling them the bonds. I've got a bunch of different posters, which reminds us that in order to persuade people of their commitment to the common good and the national cause, took a good deal of modern persuasion through propaganda. They're always very, well, here's a very famous sort of scaremongering poster. They also played very heavily on the themes of home and hearth. So much for moms not giving your sons up to the military, right? Now they're buying war bonds to support their sons in the field, presumably. And of course, there always was the appeal to family. These posters were imitated, or vice versa, in England as well. These kinds of appeals to home and hearth, to the feminine domestic side and the militaristic male side. Another famous image, Lady Liberty, involved in this. You might be interested to know that that William Gibbs McAdoo, the Secretary of the Treasury, who put this effort together, ran into a very sharp argument with Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding in April of 1917. Harding charged that this hyper promotion was, as he put it, hysterical, unseemly, which provoked the defenders of the war, not least John Sharp Williams, and almost essentially calling Harding a traitor. To his credit, Harding gave back as good as he got and refused to take back those angry words at McAdoo. McAdoo simply ignored him from that point on. The war was organized, the production was organized again in these different administrations. The War Industries Board took control of defense contracts to defense producers. Here's a kind of funny picture of a mud pit to test tanks at the Van Dorn Works in Cleveland. I obviously picked it for its Ohio connection there. The WIB was put after about 6 months of utter incoherence and just chaos there. Wilson put it under the control of a New York banker named Bernard Baruch. Of Baruch, it was said that he was from Wall Street, but not of Wall Street, unbeholden to anybody but President Wilson. And when he needed to, he just simply whipped the defense industries into line through the control of precious resources and management of prices. A description from a colleague on the WIB, Grosvenor Clark, is, I think, pertinent. Baruch's, he wrote in 1918, was an industrial dictatorship without parallel, a dictatorship by force of necessity and common consent, which encompassed the nation and united the coordinated and mobile whole. Individualistic American industrialists were aghast when they realized that industry had been drafted. The whole productive and distributive machinery of America could be directed successfully from Washington, Baruch proved. The huge, unwieldy, easygoing, individualistic, careless colossus of the North became an army from its coast to its placid farms and learned to put into its blow the whole of its incomparable strength. We have the centralization of the state here, the coordination of the economy in a planned way. It was the wish dream of the new nationalists. We could say the same about the other administrations, the food and fuel administrations. The food administration fell under the control of Herbert Hoover, the world's great organizer. I'm going to move ahead here, and even wartime propaganda was put under its own umbrella, or its own bureaucracy run by a progressive named George Creel. It seems to me that propaganda was necessary precisely because the war was not popular, and that popular opinion had to be not just encouraged to support the war, but inflamed, which is indeed what the Committee on Public Information helped to do. By 1918, the United States was roiling in violations of free speech rights, the denial of the mails to opposition and dissenting publications. And if you're the Nation magazine, if you can't mail it to your subscribers, you're as good as shut down, right? It's the only way that ideas and information was disseminated. Let me offer you a local example of the hysteria that broke out in the war and the way in which people could come afoul of the authorities for the most innocuous kinds of things. In November of 1917, the Marion Star reported on an altercation that took place at the Hotel Eastman when a local optometrist, a guy named Fred Stengel, broke into a conversation of two guys who were there, two visitors at the hotel. One was a railroad detective from Cleveland. The other guy was described as a traveler from Dunkirk, kind of cryptically. But the traveler from Dunkirk announced that if he could have his way, he'd give up a year of his life if he could just get his hands on the Kaiser. To which Mr. Stengel broke in and insisted that President Wilson is no better than the Kaiser. Given the opportunity, Wilson would do what the Kaiser is doing. Whereupon the Star reported a heated argument followed. The detective, acting on what authority I can't even imagine, except perhaps the gun in his pocket, arrested the optometrist and took him first to the police and then the mayor. The mayor was unable to find any violation of a municipal or state law, but rather than letting the optometrist go, he turned him over to the Postmaster General for federal charges. He was taken to Toledo, where he was then prosecuted. As he apologized, I didn't really mean to challenge the president, as he said, the most innocuous kind of thing, running afoul of the centralized state. Let me wrap up. It seems to me that if 1918 provided a kind of culmination of the progressive dream of the enlightened engineers, the way the war ended really kind of stymied the full completion of that dream. Because the war lasted so briefly in its high form, it didn't lock in any of those progressive achievements like the regulatory state. It also didn't really eliminate those provincialities and the traditions of individualism, which died a very, very gradual death, if indeed they've passed away at all. Here, though, is another place where Wilson's wartime failures invited reaction. The bewildering end of the war all but destroyed progressive support of Wilson's grand idealism, and it drained the last energies of progressive era reformers. Far from ending with the establishment of modern order, the war ended in the extraordinary strife of conflict with the Gallienus bombings, the terrorist bombings, the Sacco Vanzetti case, the deportation of radical aliens, some 600 of whom were kicked out of the country, racial strife, which erupted around the nation in dozens of different countries, in part because the administration did no planning for reconversion, none whatsoever. They just unleashed on the domestic economy millions of men who had been in the service. Much in contrast to World War II, at least the American government learned something from World War I in this case. Most notoriously, a huge race riot broke out in Chicago when a teenage kid swam into African Americans, was floating on his back, and he wasn't paying attention. He floated into the white beach and was stoned to death by a mob of white teenagers, which then erupted into neighborhood brawls that saw the eviction and displacement of some 1,000 or so African American residents out of white neighborhoods into the concentrated neighborhood of the South End known as Bronzeville. Far from eliminating labor strife as the progressives might have hoped, 1919 yielded over into a wave of huge strikes, beginning with a general strike in Seattle in the spring, the famous Boston police strike in September, and then the even larger steel strike in the Midwest that put out about 350,000 workers in the steel industry and ancillary industries. This was hardly the dream of the progressives, far from it. And we might even say that the failure to prepare for a reasonable reconversion of the country led to the sharp post-war depression of 1920 to 22 and helped encourage the reaction in American politics and culture that gave rise, among many other things in the 1920s, to the Ku Klux Klan. I thought I'd end on this very dour note with some Ohio history. You can see the women of the Ku Klux Klan. By its high point, we assumed that at least 4 million American men were organized in the Klan nationwide. They were everywhere. And indeed, they were strongest in Indiana. They appeared in Oregon. They were in New York. Nationwide, they were certainly in Ohio. This is the Akron Women Klan in a Klan parade in 1925, the occasion of which led W.B. Du Bois, who was here watching this parade, to write a bitter essay in which he said the reasonable people of Ohio even they seemed to have gotten wrapped up in this bizarre moment. Here is a Klan wedding from Richland County, which many of you will recognize as the Mansfield area. I know this is glib, but I joke with my students when I show this slide that, well, ladies, at least you don't have to buy a gown. You've already got one. You don't have to worry about bridal shops closing nationwide, as my wife told me today it happened. And this is my favorite also from Richland County, which reminds us that the small towns and the parochial worlds of America hadn't been rooted out in the progressive concentrations during World War I. It's my favorite because, well, you've got probably a group of Klansmen coming from church. You see the Bibles in the hands of the women, the men in their suits, and they're sitting on a Model T. Right? And if you notice this, they've got a wooden sort of homemade cross on the hood of the car. What you don't really make out here is that these are light bulbs. And they're hooked to the battery. So at night they can drive down the road with the bright fiery cross on the front. So never let it be said that even if they are cultural and political reactionaries, even they like technology. Thanks a lot. I thought I'd end that way. Open the floor, please. Here.
Yeah, while you were speaking, something came to my mind. When they instituted the draft, do you think some of the reason was they knew that there was so much division and hyphenated Americanism that they could never do it through a volunteer? I'm not stating a case, I'm correct.
I don't see it in Wilson. I mean, nothing jumps out at me, no moment where he was caught thinking in this way, although he was, as I'm sure you know, an opponent of hyphenism himself, and very much somebody who believed that to be an American was to be an American without being an Irish American. Of course, it was often said of him that he was a stout and vigorous Scotch-Irish American, but I'll leave that one alone. So the thing was, they really didn't try the volunteer system, right? I mean, they had the draft bill ready to go, even as Congress was debating the request for a declaration of war. So maybe there is that. So I'm just as quizzical about it, I guess, as you. It's over here.
As we watch these last few slides, and I started thinking about some of the head-scratching events that occurred during this time and maybe a little bit before. Can you comment about, or your studies show anything about the eugenics movement in the United States during this time, and certainly here in the Midwest?
I'm not sure about the Midwest, except for that guy up at
Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio.
the guy up at Worcester. There was they called them zoologists back then. Physical scientist at Worcester who was a rather prominent eugenicist and defender of the racial superiority doctrines of pseudoscience. That doesn't ring a bell, but it doesn't sound right. In any event, yeah, there's plenty written about it, and it was certainly a part of, and a wing of those people who were making cases for the melting pot.
I just wonder if it's connected at all to sort of that one side of progressivism that thinks that we can better society by eliminating the elements that sort of take us in the wrong direction, so prohibition and all these other things that might come into play.
Yeah, so you can see some of those progressive ideas fitting into the eugenics folks, right? And the best example, or one of the examples that's easy to hand, is Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the famous feminist, if that's what she was, and author of Women in Economics, a famous argument for the dismantling of the patriarchal family and the creation of kind of communal organizations for living and child rearing and so forth. She became a eugenicist by the 1920s. More broadly, the way I think about it is the eugenics movement was a kind of informal and side bar to the scientific racism that was embedded in the hard sciences at that point in time. And it's quite true that most professional academic zoologists bought into the hierarchy of races and assumed that the Teutonic or Anglo-Saxon were the top of the pyramid of the 5 classifications and so forth. So the eugenics movement was an element in all of this. I tend to think of it as a more informal kind of popular part.
Well, there's a government-sponsored sterilization.
Oh yeah, sure. Which lasted well into the 20th century, as we know from North Carolina and other states, yeah. Please, in the back.
Yes, the Ku Klux Klan in Ohio at this time period, I think you said the early 20s, were they involved with the cross burnings, the more violent acts that we associate with the Ku Klux Klan?
Well, it's kind of a long story, and so let me try to do it really quickly. We talk about several different stages of the Klan, and that's not even the right way to think about it because they're really not connected. In its first phase, let's talk about it that way, the Klan was basically the terrorist wing of the Democratic Party in the South. And that is the way to think about it in the late 19th century. Once segregation took hold after the turn of the century, there was really no need, and African Americans were widely and almost thoroughly disenfranchised. There was no need for that terrorist wing anymore. So the Klan was reinvigorated without really any connection to that earlier organization during the war, in 1915 to begin with, in Georgia. And it became, in the 20s, in what we call the Second Klan, almost like a race-based fraternal group. And if that makes it sound more innocuous than it was more innocuous than in its other phases. And that's probably still not the right word to use. It was less violent. There was violence associated with the Second Klan in a couple of different ways. In the first years of its organization, there was a good deal of violence in Oklahoma and Arkansas that kind of died out once it got itself established. There was a second ingredient of violence in which opponents of the Klan and the Klan parades went head to head. So there were a number of altercations between anti-Klans groups and the Klan itself, which caused violence associated with the Klan. And then as it began to die out in the late 20s, there were instances in which Klansmen were fighting themselves, fighting one another. So it's not that there wasn't any violence with it, it's just that racial terrorism was not necessarily the main part, if I can put it in those guarded terms, of the 20s Klan. Instead, it became a powerful force politically. They basically ran the state of Indiana, the Klan did. And they were prominent in other parts of the party. The 1924 Democratic Convention, the famous locked convention in New York City, referendum on an anti-Klan plank that the urban liberals behind Al Smith couldn't quite push through. They actually did. It got watered down some in a fascinating moment in American political history. And you can see from those pictures that this was, at least that there was a part of the white population that saw the Klan as a vehicle for protecting traditional values, traditional family, traditions like the Constitution. Although I've tried to take a really close look at what the Klan meant by the Constitution in the 20s, I can't find anything. They were always invoking the Constitution like it was some kind of magic wand without really explaining what part of the Constitution they saw threatened or how they saw it threatened. Those explanations are never forthcoming. So it's a stage in which it was less violent, I'll put it that way, than in its other ones. Its final real stage was, of course, the Civil Rights era Klan, and it was deadly then. So I hope that helps. There's a lot of interesting things. Professor Kazin.
You know this, but the very important thing about Second Klan is in the North, at least, their major target was Catholics.
Yes, and Jews.
One of the things that gave them a lot of power, as you know, was they were trying to enforce prohibition, where on a local basis, when a lot of times it was having a hard time being enforced, that gave them a certain legitimacy.
Right. So they hooked themselves to the prohibition movement. In fact, to sign an Ohio oath, you had to promise not to sell liquor, or actually the way the elliptical wording is, you must promise not to be a conscious breaker of the law, by which they meant, of course, prohibition, or be married to someone who was consciously breaking the law. Yes?
Take one more. I read in a book about Marion's Klan that they used to meet in a building that they rented from the Catholic Church.
No, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It really doesn't. That's, you know, that literally makes no sense. And I've never heard that. Sherry, can you help us on this?
I can actually. It was owned by, it was the former Star Building, my course building. And the Knights of Columbus owned it, they did rent it to the Klan.
That's got to be the first and only. Because really, they were vigorously anti-Catholic, anti-Papist, as they used to say. Yeah.
There was a cross burning 20 years ago in Delaware County. I know that for a fact.
Yeah. And I don't think you needed to tell us that. They did burn crosses, by the way. That's the bright, fiery cross, right? It was a symbol of them. But that doesn't necessarily lead to racial terrorism in the same way that we associate with those other phases of the Klan. Thank you all. I hope it was interesting and helpful. Thank you, Gary.